I'll never forget the look on Nathan's face when my attorney revealed the financial statements at the divorce hearing. His smug confidence evaporated instantly as his eyes darted across the pages, desperately scanning the figures that told him his perfect plan had failed. Beside him, his lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Nathan wasn't listening. His face had drained of color, making the designer stubble on his jaw stand out in stark relief against suddenly pale skin. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. For a moment, the packed courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge peered over her glasses, studying Nathan's reaction with keen interest. And me? I felt no triumph, no vindictive joy, just a profound sense of calm as months of careful planning finally came to fruition. This wasn't how our story was supposed to end. 15 years of marriage, building a life together in Denver, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues, supporting his career moves across 3 states. None of it was supposed to culminate in this sterile courtroom with a stranger in a black robe determining how to divide the remnants of our shared dreams. But then again, I never expected to return from my father's funeral to discover our accounts emptied and my husband's wedding ring left on the nightstand beside a coldly efficient note, "I've moved on. My lawyer will be in touch." Nathan thought he'd left me with nothing but my grief and a mountain of debt. He was wrong. The long drive back from Wisconsin had left me numb in more ways than one. 5 days of funeral arrangements, distant relatives, offering condolences and sorting through the modest possessions my father had left behind had hollowed me out. All I wanted was to collapse into my own bed, in my own home, with Nathan's arms around me offering the comfort he'd promised in sickness and in health, in good times and bad. But as I pulled into our driveway in the Denver suburb we'd called home for the past 3 years, something felt off. The house stood dark against the twilight sky, no welcoming lights left on by a husband expecting his wife's return. Nathan's Tesla wasn't in the driveway, but that wasn't unusual. He often worked late at the investment firm, especially when pursuing a new client. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the front door. The house felt different, colder somehow, as if the warmth had been leached from the walls themselves. "Nathan?" My voice echoed through the foyer. No answer. I flicked on lights as I moved through our home, noticing small discrepancies. Nathan's favorite jacket missing, from the coat rack. The limited edition scotch he kept for special occasions is gone from the bar cart. His side of the closet eerily sparse, with gaps where his designer suits and custom shoes should have been. My stomach tightened as I approached. Our bedroom, some primal instinct already telling me what I was about to find. There, on his nightstand, lay his wedding ring, the platinum band I'd slid onto his finger at the altar while promising forever. Beside it, a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, his precise handwriting stark against the paper. "Megan, I've moved on. My lawyer will be in touch. Nathan, 15 years of marriage. 15 years of shared dreams, compromise, and building a life together. Dismissed in 11 words." I sank onto the edge of the bed, the note trembling in my hand. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when I'd just buried my father, my last living parent. Not when I needed my husband, my partner, more than ever. The bedroom spun around me, as shock gave way to confusion, then to a sickening realization. Nathan's abrupt departure explained the calls I'd been ignoring from our bank throughout the week. Calls I'd assumed were about routine matters that could wait until after the funeral. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and logged into our joint accounts. The screen that loaded sent ice through my veins. Our checking account, which should have held over $28,000, showed a balance of $182.47. Our joint savings account, where we'd been setting aside money for a vacation home in Aspen, 0W00. Our investment portfolio, built carefully over a decade, completely liquidated. No. I whispered, frantically checking account after account only to find the same devastating story. Nathan had systematically emptied every joint account we possessed, leaving me with virtually nothing. In the midst of this financial nightmare, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hey, Megan, this is Bridget from the Crescent. There seems to be a problem with Mr. Harrington's credit card for the dinner bill tonight. Could you provide an alternative payment method?" The Crescent was one of Denver's most exclusive restaurants, a place Nathan and I reserved for anniversaries and major celebrations. My fingers hovered over the screen as I debated how to respond, when another text arrived from the same number. "So sorry to bother you again, but Ms. Keller is becoming anxious about the bill situation. Mr. Harrington said you would handle it, Ms. Keller." The name sparked a vague memory. A young woman Nathan had mentioned hiring at the firm several months ago. A financial analyst with exceptional potential, he'd said. "I think there's been a mistake," I texted back. "I'm not with my husband tonight." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. "Oh, I'm so sorry for the confusion. Ms. Keller indicated she was with your husband celebrating their apartment lease signing. I assumed you were part of the celebration. Please disregard my messages." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the hardwood floor. An apartment lease signing. With Cassidy Keller. While I was burying my father, the pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Nathan hadn't just left me. He had planned his exit meticulously, timing it to coincide with my absence, knowing I would be too devastated by my father's death to immediately grasp the full scope of his betrayal. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before emptying the contents of my stomach. Wave after wave of nausea crashed over me as the implications became clear. I was alone, financially gutted, and apparently replaced by a woman young enough to have been our daughter had we ever had children. After what felt like hours, I picked myself up off the bathroom floor and splashed cold water on my face. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, with tear tracks cutting through the light makeup I'd applied for the drive home. But behind the devastation in her eyes, I caught a glimpse of something else. A steely determination. "I'd inherited from my father. You're a Johnson," he used to tell me. "And Johnsons don't break when life gets hard. We bend, we adapt, and then we rise again stronger." With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and did something I should have done days ago. I checked my voicemail. 5 messages from our bank, each more urgent than the last, culminating in a final message from yesterday. "Mrs. Harrington, this is Thomas Bedford from First National Bank. This is our 5th attempt to reach you regarding unusual activity on your accounts. Large transfers have been initiated that diverge from your typical banking patterns. Please contact us immediately to verify these transactions." Too late. Far too late. The next message hit me like a physical blow. "Megan, it's Diane. My best friend since college," her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I don't know how to say this, but I saw Nathan yesterday at the Galleria. He was with someone, a younger woman. They were at Jensen's Jewelers, and it looked intimate. I'm so sorry to leave this on voicemail when you're dealing with your dad's funeral, but I thought you should know. Call me, please. Jensen's Jewelers, where Nathan had purchased my engagement ring 15 years ago. The final message was from a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Harrington, this is Patricia Chen from Colorado Credit Union. I'm calling regarding the second mortgage that was recently taken out on your property. There are some discrepancies in the paperwork we need to clarify. Please call us back at your earliest convenience." Second mortgage? What second mortgage? I sank back onto the bed, my mind racing to process this fresh horror. Not only had Nathan emptied our accounts, but he had apparently taken out a loan against our home. A home that was supposed to be our forever place, where we had talked about growing old together. The numbness that had enveloped me since finding Nathan's note began to recede, replaced by something hotter and more vital: anger. pure, clarifying anger that burned away the fog of shock and confusion. Nathan had planned this meticulously. He had waited until I was at my most vulnerable, grieving my father's death, distracted by funeral arrangements, to execute his exit strategy. He had calculated that in my emotional state, I wouldn't immediately check our accounts or question financial notifications. He had gambled that by the time I understood what was happening, he would be firmly established in his new life with Cassidy Keller, my financial ruin a mere footnote in his story of midlife reinvention. What he hadn't calculated, what he couldn't have known, was that my father's final months had changed me in ways even I was just beginning to understand. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I picked up my phone again and made 2 calls. The first was to Tom Freeman, a locksmith who had worked on our home when we first moved in. The second was to Valerie Santos, an attorney my father had insisted I meet 6 months ago, when his cancer diagnosis had turned terminal. You never know when you'll need a good lawyer, Dad had said with a knowing look in his eyes that I hadn't fully understood at the time. And Valerie is the best. She specializes in protecting people who didn't realize they needed protection until it was almost too late. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I made the call, fully expecting to leave a voicemail. But Valerie answered on the 3rd ring. "Megan," she said, her voice warm with recognition. "Your father said you might call someday. I'm guessing that day has come." "Yes," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "My husband has emptied our accounts and taken out a second mortgage on our home without my knowledge. He's left me for another woman, and I think he believes he's left me destitute. I need to know my options." There was a brief silence, then Valerie spoke with calm efficiency. "I can see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring any financial documentation you can access, your marriage certificate, property records if you have them, and a list of all accounts you're aware of, joint or individual. Don't contact your husband or his lawyer if they reach out. Refer them to me. And Megan, try to get some sleep. Tomorrow we will start fighting back." As I hung up, a strange calm settled over me. I was under no illusions about the battle ahead. Nathan was wealthy, connected, and ruthless in business. Qualities I had once admired and now recognized as warnings I had chosen to ignore. He would have the best lawyers, a financial head start, and the advantage of careful planning. But he had made one critical miscalculation. In the months I had spent caring for my dying father in Wisconsin, making weekly trips back and forth while Nathan claimed work obligations kept him in Denver, Dad and I had spent long hours talking about life regrets and lessons learned. A successful business owner who had built his construction company from nothing, my father had shared insights about financial protection that, at the time, had seemed abstract and unnecessary. "Marriage is beautiful," he'd told me during one of our last conversations. "But it's also a business arrangement in the eyes of the law. And in business, you always need to protect yourself, even from people you trust completely." I hadn't fully understood why he was so insistent on introducing me to his financial advisors, his attorney, and his insurance specialist. Now, his foresight felt almost prophetic. The locksmith arrived within the hour, changing every lock on the house while I gathered what financial documents remained in Nathan's home office. Most files were gone, the filing cabinet drawers hanging open like extracted teeth, but Nathan had overlooked a few key papers in his haste, including documentation of the original purchase of our home and several investment statements from the previous year. That night I slept in our guest room, unable to face the bed I had shared with Nathan for 3 years. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by moments of crashing awareness when I'd remember all over again that my life had imploded while I was lighting a candle at my father's memorial service. Morning brought a strange clarity. As I showered and dressed for my meeting with Valerie, I found myself studying my reflection with new eyes. At 42, I was still attractive, though the strain of the past few months had left its mark. The careful highlights Nathan had always encouraged, to keep you looking young, honey, had grown out somewhat, revealing more of my natural chestnut color. The designer clothes he'd selected to elevate my professional image as the wife of a rising investment executive hung differently on my frame, which had become leaner during my father's illness. I looked different because I was different. The woman who had left for Wisconsin 10 days ago, still securely married, financially comfortable, and focused on pleasing her ambitious husband, no longer existed. In her place stood someone harder, warier, with a growing understanding that survival would require accessing parts of myself I had allowed to atrophy during 15 years of marriage. Valerie's office was located in a converted Victorian home in one of Denver's historic neighborhoods, the exterior charm belying the cutting-edge technology and sleek professionalism within. Her assistant, a young man with kind eyes and efficient movements, led me to a conference room where Valerie was already reviewing documents. She rose to greet me, her handshake firm and direct. In her mid-50s, Valerie Santos radiated a quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. Here was a woman who had seen it all, navigated the worst of human behavior, and emerged undefeated. "Before we start," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat, "I want you to understand something important. What your husband has done, emptying accounts and taking out loans without your knowledge, especially during a family crisis, isn't just cruel. Depending on the specifics, it may cross legal lines. This isn't just about division of assets anymore. This is about protecting you from financial abuse. Financial abuse." The term hit me with unexpected force. I had always associated abuse with physical violence or emotional cruelty, not spreadsheets and bank transfers. But as Valerie began to outline what had likely happened, I recognized the deliberate nature of Nathan's actions for what they were. A calculated attempt to leave me vulnerable and powerless. "Now," Valerie continued, opening a leather portfolio, "let's talk about what your father and I discussed 6 months ago." I blinked in surprise. "You and my dad had discussions about me?" Valerie's expression softened slightly. James was concerned. "He didn't share specifics, but he mentioned observing dynamics in your marriage that troubled him. He wanted to ensure you had protection in place, just in case." My throat tightened with emotion. Even in his final months, fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win. My father had been looking out for me, seeing warning signs I had been too close to recognize. "What kind of protection?" I asked. Valerie smiled for the first time, a smile that transformed her professional demeanor into something wolfishly satisfied, the kind your husband never knew existed. "Let's take a step back," Valerie suggested, closing her portfolio momentarily. "Before we discuss the protections your father put in place, I need to understand your marriage. The history, the dynamics. It all matters for how we proceed." I took a deep breath, trying to organize 15 years of marriage into something coherent. Where to even begin? "I met Nathan during my final year of graduate school," I said, surprising myself with how distant that memory now felt. "I was getting my MBA at Northwestern, and he was already working at Larson Partners in Chicago. We met at a networking event. He was representing his firm, scouting for new talent." What I didn't add was how dazzled I'd been by Nathan Harrington that night. At 31, 5 years my senior, he'd seemed the embodiment of everything I aspired to become. Confident, articulate, moving through the room with an ease I could only pretend to possess. When he'd singled me out among dozens of eager students, I'd felt specially chosen, marked for success by his attention. "We dated for 2 years before getting married," I continued. "It was a whirlwind romance at first. Nathan was ambitious, driven. He talked about building an empire together, about how, with my financial acumen and his networking skills, we could become a power couple in the financial world." Valerie nodded, taking notes. "And your career? You also have an MBA from Northwestern, correct?" Yes. I was hired by Wellington Financial right out of graduate school. I was on track for management when Nathan received his first major promotion, which required relocating to Minneapolis. I paused, remembering the conversations, or rather, the lack of conversations, around that first move. Nathan had presented it as a fait accompli, the next logical step in our shared journey toward success. The fact that it disrupted my own promising career path had been minimized, reframed as a minor detour in service of our larger goals. I left my position at Wellington and found a job at a smaller firm in Minneapolis, I explained. It was a step down, but Nathan assured me it was temporary, that once he established himself, I'd have opportunities through his connections. And did those opportunities materialize? Valerie asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. Some did. I worked for 3 different firms over the next 7 years as we followed Nathan's career from Minneapolis to Seattle, then finally to Denver. Each move was presented as the last one we'd need to make, the position that would finally allow us to settle down, maybe start a family. The family that never materialized. The children we kept postponing because the timing was never quite right, because Nathan always had another mountain to climb first, another milestone to reach before we could focus on parenthood. Your work history shows significant adaptability, Valerie observed. That's a valuable experience. It was a kind reframing of what I now recognized as a fragmented career, forever interrupted by Nathan's ambitions. I had adapted, yes, finding new positions in each city, building networks from scratch, proving my value again and again, only to uproot everything when Nathan's next opportunity arose. 3 years ago, Nathan was offered a partnership position at Montgomery Adams here in Denver, I continued. It came with a substantial increase in compensation and influence. We bought our house in Cherry Creek, joined the right clubs, started entertaining his colleagues and clients. It felt like we'd finally arrived at the destination we'd been working toward all those years. I remembered the housewarming party we'd thrown, how Nathan had raised a toast to new beginnings and putting down roots at last. How earnestly I'd believed him. And your career at this point? Valerie prompted. I was hired as a financial advisor at Westridge Investments. It was a good position, but after our 2nd year in Denver, Nathan suggested I scale back to part-time consultancy work. His income had increased significantly, and he felt my energy would be better spent managing our growing social obligations and supporting his networking needs. I heard it as I said it, the subtle diminishment that had occurred so gradually. I hardly noticed. How my professional identity had been slowly subsumed into Nathan's, my value increasingly measured by how well I enhanced his career rather than building my own. Did that arrangement work for you? Valerie asked, her tone still carefully neutral. I considered the question. Had it worked for me? At the time, I'd rationalized the shift as a natural evolution of our partnership. Nathan's career was taking off, generating more than enough income for both of us. The consulting work kept my skills sharp while giving me flexibility to manage our increasingly complex social calendar. It had seemed like a reasonable compromise. I thought it did, I answered honestly. I enjoyed aspects of it. The consulting allowed me to choose interesting projects, and I took pride in creating the perfect environment for Nathan's business entertaining. It wasn't until my father became ill last year that I began to see things differently. Valerie's eyebrows lifted slightly. How so? My father built his construction company from nothing. He started with a single truck and a toolbox, working 18-hour days until he could hire his first employee. By the time he retired, Johnson Construction employed over 50 people and had contracts throughout Wisconsin. I smiled, remembering Dad's weathered hands, always slightly stained no matter how thoroughly he scrubbed them, the calluses that never quite disappeared even years into retirement. When his cancer was diagnosed as terminal, I started making regular trips to Wisconsin to help him get his affairs in order. Nathan came for the initial diagnosis, but after that, He always had reasons why he couldn't accompany me. Critical meetings, important clients, business trips that couldn't be rescheduled. The more time I spent with my father during those final months, the more his perspective began to influence me. Dad had always been politely reserved around Nathan, never openly critical, but never entirely warm either. During one of my visits, when pain medication had lowered his usual filters, he'd finally voiced his concerns. "Your mother and I were true partners, Meggie," he'd said, using my childhood nickname. "We built our life together, brick by brick, with equal say and equal respect. I watch how that husband of yours treats you, like you're an accessory to his success rather than its foundation, and it breaks my heart." I'd defended Nathan reflexively, explaining the complexities of his career, the pressures he faced, the plans we still had for the future. Dad had simply looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation that I now recognized as pity. "The thing about plans," he'd said softly, "is that they're just pretty stories we tell ourselves until somebody's actions tell the true tale." I shared this conversation with Valerie, watching as she made notes. After that, I started paying more attention to patterns I'd previously ignored. How Nathan would dismiss my input on financial decisions despite my MBA and professional background. How he'd interrupt me at social gatherings to clarify points I was perfectly capable of articulating. How he'd begun commenting on my appearance more critically, suggesting Botox for the faint lines around my eyes, noting when I gained a few pounds during the stress of Dad's illness. "These realizations came gradually?" Valerie asked. "Yes. It wasn't a single moment of clarity, more like a slow accumulation of evidence I could no longer rationalize away. The more time I spent with Dad, helping manage his business affairs during his illness, the more I reconnected with the ambitious, independent woman I'd been before meeting Nathan. I even started considering returning to full-time work once Dad's situation resolved." I swallowed hard, the grief still fresh. I never got the chance to discuss those plans with Nathan. Dad's condition deteriorated quickly in the final weeks. I was in Wisconsin almost constantly for the last month, and when I called Nathan with updates, he seemed increasingly distant, distracted. I attributed it to work stress and the strain my absence was putting on our marriage. A bitter laugh escaped me. Now I understand he was planning his exit the entire time, probably moving his assets, setting up his new life with Cassidy, all while I was holding my father's hand as he died. The cruelty of the timing struck me anew. Nathan hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had exploited my most vulnerable moment to maximize his advantage. "Did you have any suspicions about his relationship with this Cassidy person before yesterday?" Valerie asked. "None. Nathan mentioned hiring her about 8 months ago. A finance prodigy from Stanford, he called her. He occasionally referenced her work on various projects, but nothing that raised red flags. I was distracted by Dad's illness, making trips back and forth to Wisconsin every week or two. I hesitated, acknowledging a painful truth. I wasn't fully present in my marriage during those months." "You were caring for your dying father," Valerie stated firmly. "That doesn't justify betrayal." She was right, of course, but part of me still instinctively shouldered the blame. Wasn't that the pattern of our entire marriage? Nathan made choices, and I adjusted, accommodated, rationalized. "When did your father introduce us?" Valerie asked, shifting direction. "About 6 months ago." Dad's prognosis had turned terminal, and he became insistent about certain arrangements. He introduced me to his estate attorney, his financial advisor, and you. At the time, I thought he was simply being thorough about his own affairs, making sure I had support for executing his will and managing whatever modest assets he might leave. "But that wasn't all he was doing," Valerie said, opening her portfolio again and extracting a thick folder. "No," I agreed quietly. "I see that now. Somehow, He recognized what was happening in my marriage before I could admit it to myself. James was an exceptionally astute man, Valerie said. When he contacted me, he was careful not to overstep. He simply said he had observed concerning patterns in your marriage and wanted to ensure you had protection in place should his instincts prove correct. She laid several documents on the table between us. With your father's guidance, we established 3 things. First, a private trust in your name only, funded initially with your inheritance from your maternal grandmother. Nathan was likely unaware of these funds, as they remained in Wisconsin under your maiden name. I remembered the inheritance, $180,000, that had come to me when Grandma Johnson died shortly after our wedding. Nathan had wanted me to add it to our joint investment portfolio, but Dad had suggested keeping it separate for a special project someday. I had followed Dad's advice more out of respect for him than any conscious decision to hide assets from my husband. Second, Valerie continued, your father transferred ownership shares of Johnson Construction to this trust over the past 5 years, small percentages each year as part of his succession planning. While the company was sold to the management team upon his death as planned, your ownership stake was converted to a structured payout that Nathan has no access to. I stared at her, struggling to process this information. I knew Dad was transferring some shares for tax purposes, but I had no idea it was this significant. Your father was careful to document that these transfers were inheritance planning, not an attempt to hide assets, Valerie explained. Everything was properly reported on tax returns. The transfers are completely legitimate and predate any marital issues. And third, I asked, sensing there was more. Third, we established a separate LLC for consulting services in your maiden name with its own accounts and contracts. The part-time consulting work you've been doing for the past 2 years? Those clients have actually been contracting with Johnson Financial Consulting, LLC, a company you own entirely separately from your marital assets. My head was spinning. But the payments went into our joint account. Some did, Valerie corrected. About 40% of your consulting income was directed to your joint accounts, enough to appear transparent to Nathan. The remainder was paid directly to the LLC and invested through a separate financial advisor in Wisconsin. I struggled to comprehend the scope of what my father had orchestrated. While I had been blithely assuming our marriage was solid, if imperfect, Dad had been quietly helping me establish financial independence I didn't yet know I needed. Is this legal? I asked hesitantly. Absolutely, Valerie confirmed without hesitation. Married individuals are permitted to own separate property, particularly inherited assets and businesses established with separate funds. We were careful to maintain clear documentation showing these assets never commingled with marital property. Your father was protecting inheritance rights, not hiding marital assets. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Megan, what isn't legal is what Nathan has done. Emptying joint accounts without consent and taking loans against jointly owned property without your knowledge or signature. Those actions cross lines that will significantly strengthen our position. For the first time since finding Nathan's note, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't destitute after all. I had resources Nathan knew nothing about, protection my father had wisely put in place. How much? I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. How much is in these separate accounts and entities? Valerie slid a financial summary across the table. The figure at the bottom, representing my grandmother's inheritance, now grown through careful investment, the converted ownership shares of Johnson Construction, and the accumulated consulting income, was substantial. Not wealth by Nathan's standards, perhaps, but more than enough to provide security and independence while I rebuilt my life. There's something else you should know, Valerie said, extracting one final document from her folder. Your father made me promise to give you this after his death, but only if circumstances indicated it was necessary. She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal, and unfolded the single page inside. "Maggie," it began, instantly bringing tears to my eyes. "If you're reading this, it means I was right about that husband of yours, and I take no joy in that. I saw in him something I recognized from my years in business, a man who values people only for what they can provide him. I watched him diminish. You're light year by year, and it broke my heart. But you are your mother's daughter too, resilient, brilliant, and far stronger than you realize. The arrangements we've made aren't just about money, they're about giving you options, the freedom to rebuild on your own terms. Nathan underestimated you. They always do. Show him who you really are. All my love, Dad." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears flowing freely now. Even from beyond the grave, my father was protecting me, believing in me, seeing clearly what I had been unable to see for myself. Valerie waited patiently while I composed myself, then spoke with quiet confidence. "Your husband believes he's left you with nothing. He expects you to be desperate, pliable, willing to accept whatever settlement terms he offers just to survive. That perceived leverage is his greatest weapon." Her smile was small but determined. "Let's show him just how wrong he is." The days following my meeting with Valerie passed in a blur of activity. On her advice, I filed emergency motions to freeze our remaining joint assets, documented the unauthorized second mortgage Nathan had taken out on our home, and prepared financial affidavits detailing the accounts he had emptied. Meanwhile, Valerie's team worked discreetly to consolidate my separate assets without alerting Nathan to their existence. "The element of surprise is our greatest advantage," she reminded me during our daily check-ins. "Once we reveal your financial independence, we can't unring that bell." On the surface, I projected calm efficiency, meeting with financial advisors, gathering documents, following Valerie's strategic roadmap step by methodical step. Inside, however, a hurricane of emotions threatened my composure at every turn. 1 week after Nathan's departure, the first communication from his attorney arrived, a settlement proposal so insultingly one-sided it could only have been designed to capitalize on my presumed desperation. Nathan would generously allow me to keep my personal possessions and car, while he retained the house, all investment accounts, and his entire retirement portfolio. In exchange, I would agree to a lump, some payment that wouldn't cover 6 months of living expenses in Denver. "This is actually helpful," Valerie noted when I forwarded her the proposal. "It shows he believes you're completely vulnerable. Keep playing into that assumption for now." A day later, I received my first direct contact from Nathan since his departure, a text message that made my hands shake with anger. "Megan, my attorney says you've been difficult about the settlement. This is already painful enough without dragging things out. Be reasonable and we can both move forward with dignity." Nathan. Dignity. As if there were anything dignified about emptying our accounts while I buried my father. As if there was dignity in replacing me with a woman barely out of college while I spent months shuttling between Denver and Wisconsin, caring for my dying parent. I didn't respond. 3 days later, another text. "The second mortgage was necessary business planning T. Had discussed with you previously, your memory of events won't hold up legally. Please be sensible and accept the settlement offer." This blatant lie, Nathan had never mentioned a second mortgage, revealed the gaslighting I had normalized throughout our marriage. How many times had he rewritten history, insisting I had agreed to decisions I had no memory of discussing? How often had I doubted my own recollection rather than questioning his? Still, I didn't respond, following Valerie's guidance to maintain complete radio silence. On day 10, Diane invited me to dinner at her home in Boulder, offering the first social interaction I'd had since my world imploded. "You look better than I expected," she said as she embraced me at her door. "More, I don't know, present somehow." I managed a small smile. "Present is a good word for it. I've been absent from my own life for a long time, I think. Over homemade pasta and wine, I shared the broad strokes of what had happened, including the revelation of my father's hidden financial planning. I'm still processing how much Dad saw that I couldn't or wouldn't see, I admitted. All those years of Nathan controlling our finances, making unilateral decisions, treating my career as secondary, I just accepted it as the natural order of our partnership. Diane, who had been happily single since a brief marriage in her 20s, had never quite warmed to Nathan. Your father always watched Nathan like a hawk at family gatherings, she recalled. I thought it was just typical father-in-law suspicion, but clearly he was picking up on something deeper. What I can't figure out, I said, refilling our wine glasses, is when I lost myself. When did I become this appendage to Nathan's ambitions rather than a person with my own dreams? It didn't happen overnight, Diane observed. I remember when you first started dating him. You were still the Megan I knew from Northwestern, ambitious and opinionated. The changes were so gradual they were easy to miss. She hesitated before continuing. I almost said something after you moved to Seattle. You called me describing your new job there, and everything was framed in terms of how it would support Nathan's career. It's not my dream position, but it gives me flexibility to host Nathan's business dinners. The hours aren't challenging, but that means I can travel with Nathan to industry events. It was like you were describing a support role in his life, not your own career. Her words struck a painful chord of recognition. Somewhere along the line, I had internalized the idea that our shared success meant prioritizing Nathan's opportunities at the expense of my own. When did that asymmetry become normal? You know what's strange? I said, staring into my wine glass. Part of me still feels guilty for having these separate assets. Like I've done something wrong by not being completely financially dependent on him, even though he's the one who betrayed our marriage. That's how conditioning works, Diane replied gently. Nathan spent years training you to define loyalty as submission to his judgment, especially in financial matters. Breaking that programming isn't instantaneous. Later that night, back in the guest room that had become my bedroom, I sat at the small desk and began a different kind of accounting. Not of dollars and cents, but of the personal costs of my marriage. I created 3 columns in my journal. What I gained, what I lost, what I compromised. Under what I gained, I listed the obvious benefits: financial security, now revealed as illusory, social status in certain circles, a partner who had, at least in the early years, encouraged my ambitions, albeit within carefully defined parameters that never threatened his primacy. The what I lost column proved more painful to compile. Career momentum interrupted by multiple relocations. Close friendships that withered as I prioritized Nathan's social network. The children we never had because the timing was never quite right for his career trajectory. My relationship with my father during his final years, diminished by Nathan's reluctance to spend time in Wisconsin. But it was the what I compromised list that truly shook me. My financial autonomy, my professional identity, my confidence in my own judgment, my connections to friends and family who saw Nathan clearly, before I could, my personal style, gradually modified to fit Nathan's preferences. Even my body, the subtle remarks about my weight, suggestions for cosmetic procedures, the implied comparison to younger women like Cassidy. I had compromised so much of myself, piece by tiny piece, that the woman Nathan left behind barely resembled the one he had married 15 years ago. The realization wasn't just heartbreaking, it was infuriating. Sleep eluded me that night as I grappled with this accounting of my marriage. Around 3 a.m., restless and raw with emotion, I did something Valerie had explicitly advised against. I looked up Cassidy Keller on social media. She was exactly as I had imagined, 26 years old, with the glossy perfection of youth and privilege. Stanford undergraduate, MBA from Columbia. Her profile was filled with fitness achievements, exotic Travel and professional milestones. In one recent photo, I spotted a familiar watch on her wrist, a women's Cartier that Nathan had given me for our 10th anniversary, which had mysteriously disappeared during a business trip last year. He had filed an insurance claim, insisting it must have been stolen from our hotel room, another lie in a marriage apparently built on them. What struck me most about Cassidy's carefully curated online presence wasn't her beauty or youth. It was how much she reminded me of myself at that. Ambitious, accomplished, eager to make her mark in a male-dominated industry. I recognized the hungry look in her eyes, the desire to be taken seriously, to prove herself worthy of the opportunities coming her way. Did she have any idea what awaited her? Could she see how her promising career would be subtly reframed as a supporting element in Nathan's narrative? Did she understand how gradually her sharp edges would be smoothed, her independence redirected into building his kingdom rather than her own? I closed my laptop, suddenly exhausted. Nathan hadn't replaced me with his opposite. He had replaced me with a younger version of who I used to be, before he reshaped me into the perfect corporate wife. The cycle would repeat itself, though Cassidy might take longer to dim her light, for his comfort. The next morning, I awoke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The vulnerable, reactive woman who had stumbled through the first days after Nathan's desertion was receding, replaced by someone more reminiscent of the ambitious MBA graduate I'd once been, but tempered by hard-earned wisdom. I called Valerie, before my first cup of coffee. "I'm ready," I told her without a preamble. "I've been playing defense, but it's time to take control of this narrative." "What changed?" she asked, though her tone suggested she'd been expecting this call. "I realized I've spent 15 years adapting to Nathan's agenda. I won't spend another day doing it." My voice was steady, my resolve absolute. He expects me to be desperate, compliant, grateful for whatever scraps he's willing to offer in the settlement. I want him to understand exactly how wrong he is. "There's a risk in revealing our full hand too early," Valerie cautioned, "especially regarding your separate assets." "I understand the strategic considerations," I replied, surprised by my own confidence. "But there's a psychological element here that matters just as much. Nathan derives power from believing I'm at his mercy. Every day we allow him to maintain that illusion. We reinforce his control." There was a brief silence before Valerie responded. "You're right. The legal strategy matters, but so does reclaiming your agency. Let's meet this morning to map out our approach." 3 hours later, I sat in Valerie's office as she outlined a revised strategy. Rather than waiting for Nathan's next move, we would take the initiative, filing for divorce on grounds of financial misconduct and abandonment. The filing would include comprehensive documentation of Nathan's unauthorized withdrawals and the fraudulent second mortgage, along with an assertion of my right to significant support given the length of our marriage and my career sacrifices, to facilitate his advancement. What it would not include, yet, was any mention of my separate assets. "We'll proceed in strategic phases," Valerie explained. "Phase 1 establishes his misconduct and your apparent vulnerability. We let him believe his advantage is overwhelming." "Then what?" I asked. "Then we schedule mediation," she continued. "This is where psychology becomes crucial. Nathan will enter that room believing you're desperate and cornered. His attorney will present another lowball offer, perhaps slightly improved from the first. You'll appear hesitant, uncertain. And then, we reveal the existence of my separate assets," I finished. Valerie nodded, a gleam of professional satisfaction in her eyes. "Precisely. Not just as a shield, but as leverage. By documenting that these assets predated any marital issues and were properly maintained as separate property, we establish that you haven't been hiding marital assets. You've been protecting your inheritance and business interests, exactly as you're entitled to do." I considered the plan, envisioning Nathan's reaction when he realized his calculated betrayal hadn't left me destitute after all. The moment he understood that while he believed he was expertly maneuvering me into a corner, I had resources and options he never suspected. "There's one more element to consider," Valerie added, her expression softening slightly. "Beyond the financial and legal considerations, what do you actually want from this divorce?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on responding to Nathan's actions, on not being victimized by his betrayal, that I hadn't fully contemplated my own desired outcome. I began, then paused, realizing I needed to be precise. "I want financial security, obviously. I want recognition of my contributions to his career success. I want our home, not because I'm attached to it specifically, but because he assumed he could simply take it along with everything else." I took a deep breath, acknowledging deeper truths. "More than anything, I want to rebuild my professional identity on my terms. I want to use the consulting business my father helped establish as a foundation for whatever comes next. And I want Nathan to understand that I was never the subordinate partner he believed me to be." Valerie nodded, making notes. "Those are all achievable objectives. But I need to ask, is there any part of you that wants reconciliation? Sometimes when the initial shock passes, those feelings emerge." "No," I replied without hesitation. Whatever I once felt for Nathan died the moment I understood he had exploited my father's death to maximize his advantage in leaving me. There's no coming back from that kind of calculated cruelty. As I drove home from Valerie's office, I found myself detouring to a neighborhood I rarely visited, the prosperous area near the university where many young professionals lived. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot of an upscale apartment complex and checked the directory. Keller, C, Unit 718. So this was where Nathan and Cassidy had signed their lease while I was lighting candles at my father's memorial service. The building was exactly what I would have expected. Modern, sleek, prominently featuring a state-of-the-art fitness center and rooftop pool. The kind of place that would appeal to someone building their first vision of adult success. I sat in my car, surprised by my own calm as I gazed up at the building. I had come here expecting to feel a surge of jealousy or renewed hurt. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. Not for myself, but for the young woman who had unwittingly stepped into a role I was finally escaping. Did Cassidy understand that Nathan's charm came with conditions? That his support would last exactly as long as she reflected well on him, enhanced his stature, and acquiesced to his vision of their shared future? Did she realize that in Nathan's world, partnership meant his goals always took precedence? These weren't questions I needed answered. They were realizations Cassidy would come to in her own time, as I had in mine. As I put my car in reverse to leave, movement near the entrance caught my eye. Nathan emerged from the building, dressed in the casual but expensive weekend wear he favored for non-business days. He appeared engaged in an intense phone conversation, his free hand gesturing emphatically in the way it did when he was displeased. I froze, unprepared for this accidental encounter. But Nathan never glanced in my direction as he paced near the entrance, too absorbed in his call to notice my car in the visitor section. This was my first glimpse of him since discovering his betrayal, and I was struck by how ordinary he appeared. Not a monstrous villain, not even the commanding presence I had built up in my mind during our years together. Just a man in expensive clothes, visibly agitated about something not going his way. For so long, Nathan had loomed large in my life, his opinions shaping my choices, his approval determining my worth, his ambitions directing our shared path. Seeing him now, unaware of my presence, I realized he had never been as impressive as I had allowed myself to believe. His power had come largely from my willingness to grant it. As I drove away, I felt the final pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Not just understanding what had happened in my marriage, but why I had permitted it. The ambitious young woman who had caught Nathan's eye at that networking event had been flattered by his attention. eager for validation from someone already established in the world she aspired to join. That initial dynamic had set the template for our entire relationship, with me constantly seeking approval and him perpetually positioning himself as the arbiter of my worth. Back at the house, I found myself drawn to Nathan's home office, a room I had avoided since discovering his betrayal. With new purpose, I began methodically searching through the documents he had left behind, looking not for financial records this time, but for something more personal. In the back of his desk drawer, I found what I was searching for: a small, velvet box containing the original engagement ring he had given me 15 years ago. I had upgraded to a larger diamond on our 10th anniversary, at Nathan's insistence, and the original ring had disappeared from my jewelry box shortly afterward. Nathan had claimed he was having it cleaned as a surprise, then later suggested, "It must have been misplaced during our move to Denver." Another lie. He had simply reclaimed it, likely always intending it for the next woman once I had served my purpose. I slipped the ring onto my finger, where it sat unfamiliar after years of wearing its more impressive replacement. The diamond was modest by Nathan's current standards, all he could afford as a rising associate at the time. But to the young woman I had been, it had represented every dream of the future, every promise of partnership and shared success. Looking at it now, I felt no nostalgia, no longing for what might have been. Instead, I saw it for what it truly was. The first installment in a transaction where my value was always conditional, always subject to depreciation and eventual replacement. Removed the ring and placed it in an envelope, which I addressed to Cassidy Keller. No note, no explanation needed. Just a small diamond with a history she deserved to understand before it became part of her own story. I never mailed it. That would have been petty, vindictive in a way that didn't serve my own healing. Instead, I placed the envelope in my desk drawer, a tangible reminder of the woman I had been and the one I was becoming. Someday, perhaps, I would sell that ring and use the proceeds for something that honored my own journey, not the false narrative Nathan had constructed. That night, for the first time since returning to an empty house with a cold note on the nightstand, I slept in the master bedroom. Not because I had forgiven Nathan or reconciled with the pain of his betrayal, but because I had finally understood a fundamental truth. This house, this life, this future were mine to reclaim, redesign, and rebuild on my own terms. The vulnerable, uncertain woman who had stood frozen in shock upon discovering Nathan's betrayal was transforming. Not overnight in some dramatic Hollywood epiphany, but gradually and authentically, one difficult realization at a time. By morning, I knew exactly what I wanted from the divorce proceedings that lay ahead. Not just financial assets or property, but something far more valuable: the complete reclamation of my own story. The following week marked a turning point in my approach to the divorce. With Valerie's guidance, we filed the initial petition outlining Nathan's financial misconduct while strategically omitting any mention of my separate assets. The legal machinery had been set in motion, but I knew documents and court filings were just one dimension of the battle ahead. "You need more than just me in your corner," Valerie advised during our strategy session. "Legal counsel is essential, but rebuilding your life requires different kinds of support." She was right. While I had Diane's friendship and Valerie's legal expertise, I needed guidance in reconstructing my professional identity after years of defining myself primarily as Nathan's wife. The consulting business my father had helped establish was a foundation, but transforming it from a side project into a sustainable career would require skills I hadn't exercised in years. That's how I found myself sitting in the lobby of Davidson Financial Advisors on a Wednesday morning, waiting to meet Rebecca Davidson, the firm's founder and CEO. Rebecca had been recommended by Valerie as someone who specialized in helping women navigate financial transitions after divorce or widowhood. "She's not just a financial advisor," Valerie had explained. "She's built a practice specifically focused on women reclaiming financial independence. and she absolutely despises men who use financial control as a weapon in relationships. The woman who emerged from the conference room to greet me wasn't what I had expected. In her early 60s, Rebecca Davidson wore her silver hair in a stylish, asymmetrical cut that framed sharp, observant eyes. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but assessing. "Megan Johnson Harrington," she said, using the hyphenated name. I had only recently begun reintroducing into my professional identity. "I've been looking forward to meeting you since Valerie called. Please come in." Her office was a departure from the masculine leather and mahogany aesthetic that dominated financial firms like the ones Nathan frequented. The space was bright, with contemporary art on the walls and a wall of windows overlooking downtown Denver. Photographs of Rebecca with various women, clients I presumed, were displayed prominently on a side table. "Before we start," Rebecca said as we settled into comfortable chairs, "I want to clarify my role. I'm not here to simply manage your assets or create investment strategies, though that's certainly part of what I do. My work is about something deeper, helping women develop true financial agency after situations where that power was undermined or controlled by someone else." She leaned forward slightly. "Valerie shared the broad strokes of your situation. What Nathan did, emptying accounts while you were at your father's funeral, is unfortunately a scenario I've seen before. Men like your husband count on shame and shock to paralyze their wives long enough to establish insurmountable advantages. That's exactly what happened," I admitted. "If my father hadn't put protections in place without my knowledge, Nathan's strategy would have worked perfectly." Rebecca nodded. "James Johnson. I didn't know him personally, but his reputation in Wisconsin business circles was stellar. From what Valerie told me, he recognized warning signs you couldn't see from inside the marriage." "I still struggle with that," I confessed. "How did I miss what was right in front of me for 15 years? Rebecca's expression softened. "When you're in the forest, it's nearly impossible to see its shape. The trees block your view of the patterns. Only someone standing on a distant hill can see the full landscape." She reached for a folder on her desk. "Your father stood on that hill. He saw what you couldn't from your position. But now you've emerged from the forest, and my job is to help you gain that higher perspective on your financial landscape." Over the next 2 hours, Rebecca and I walked through my complete financial picture, both the joint assets currently frozen by court order and the separate holdings my father had established. With methodical precision, she helped me understand the full scope of my resources and the strategic approach to deploying them. "You're in a stronger position than most women in your situation," she observed. "These separate assets give you breathing room to make decisions from a place of clarity rather than desperation. But there's something more valuable than money that I want to help you reclaim." "What's that?" I asked. "Your financial confidence," Rebecca replied. "From what you've shared, Nathan systematically undermined your trust in your own financial judgment, despite your MBA and professional background. That erosion of confidence is often more damaging than the actual financial misconduct." Her words resonated painfully. How many times had Nathan dismissed my input on investment decisions with a patronizing smile? How often had he responded to my questions about our financial planning with vague reassurances that he had it handled? "The first step in rebuilding that confidence is taking full inventory of your skills and experience," Rebecca continued. "You've described your career as fragmented due to multiple relocations for Nathan's advancement. But I see something different. I see adaptability, resilience, and the ability to rebuild professional networks in diverse markets. Those are valuable assets in today's business environment." She pulled out a notepad and began listing my professional accomplishments and skills. Not as Nathan's wife, but as an independent financial professional with an MBA from Northwestern. And experience across multiple markets. Seeing my career reframed this way was jarring but empowering. "Now, tell me about Johnson Financial Consulting," Rebecca prompted. Your father established the structure, but what's your vision for it? The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on responding to Nathan's betrayal that I hadn't allowed myself to think expansively about what might come next professionally. I've been doing primarily portfolio analysis for small business owners, I said slowly. But what I've enjoyed most is helping women entrepreneurs understand their financial options and develop sustainable growth strategies. Many of them have brilliant business concepts but limited financial literacy. Rebecca's eyes lit up. That's a vastly underserved market. Most financial advisors focus on high-net-worth individuals or established corporations. Small women-owned businesses fall through the cracks. Exactly, I agreed, feeling a spark of genuine enthusiasm for the first time in months. These women don't need complex investment structures or aggressive growth strategies. They need someone who can translate financial concepts into practical approaches that align with their business values and personal goals. For the next hour, Rebecca helped me outline a business model that would transform Johnson Financial Consulting from a side project into a viable specialty practice. She asked probing questions, challenged assumptions, and offered insights from her own experience building a female-focused financial practice. By the time our meeting concluded, I had not just a financial strategy for navigating my divorce, but the beginnings of a professional roadmap for what would come after. One last thing before you go, Rebecca said as I gathered my materials. What Nathan did, both financially and emotionally, was abuse. Not the kind that leaves visible bruises, but abuse nonetheless. Financial control is about power, not money. I stiffened slightly at the term. Abuse seemed too strong a word for what I had experienced. Weren't abused women those who lived in fear, who suffered physical violence, who couldn't leave? Reading my hesitation, Rebecca continued gently. I've worked with hundreds of women emerging from financially controlling relationships. The patterns are consistent regardless of income level or social status. The isolation from supportive friends and family, the gradual erosion of professional identity, the subtle messages that major decisions aren't really yours to make, the implicit or explicit expectation that your primary value lies in supporting his ambitions rather than pursuing your own. She opened a desk drawer and removed a book, which she handed to me. Financial Gaslighting, Recognizing and Recovering from Economic Abuse in Relationships. The author was a psychologist specializing in financial trauma. This might help you contextualize your experience, Rebecca suggested. Understanding the systematic nature of what happened can help dispel the shame and self-doubt many women carry after these relationships end. On the drive home, Rebecca's words kept replaying in my mind. Had I been in an abusive relationship without recognizing it? The term seemed at odds with our outwardly perfect life. The beautiful home, exotic vacations, social status, material comfort. Nathan had never physically threatened me, rarely raised his voice, maintained a facade of partnership and respect in public. Yet the patterns Rebecca described fit with unsettling precision. The way Nathan had gradually isolated me from friends who questioned his decisions. His dismissal of my professional judgment despite my qualifications. The unilateral financial moves presented as joint decisions after the fact. The subtle but persistent message that gratitude was the appropriate response to the lifestyle his superior financial acumen provided. That evening, I began reading the book Rebecca had given me, recognizing my marriage in its clinical descriptions of financial control tactics. One passage in particular stopped me cold. Financial abusers often exploit major life transitions, illness, death of a loved one, pregnancy, to escalate control, knowing their partners are most vulnerable during these periods. The ultimate expression of this exploitation is the exit abandonment, where the abuser depletes shared resources and departs during a particularly vulnerable moment, maximizing both financial advantage and psychological devastation. Nathan had executed a textbook, exit abandonment, timing his departure to coincide with my father's death, when I would be most emotionally fragmented and least able to immediately challenge his financial maneuvers. This wasn't just opportunistic timing. It was a calculated strategy designed to leave me not just financially compromised, but psychologically shattered. The realization was both disturbing and strangely liberating. For months, I had been asking myself what I had done wrong, how I had failed to see the signs, why Nathan had chosen that particular moment to leave. Now I understood. The timing wasn't about anything I had done or failed to do. It was a tactical decision to maximize his advantage and minimize my resistance. The next morning, I met with Valerie to update her on my conversation with Rebecca and the insights I'd gained from the Cassidy book. "I'm not surprised Rebecca gave you that resource," Valerie commented. "She's been a pioneer in recognizing financial abuse as a distinct form of domestic violence, especially in high-income relationships where it often goes unrecognized." "It's helped me understand Nathan's pattern," I acknowledged. "But more importantly, it's helping me contextualize my own reactions. Why I accepted his financial control, why I doubted my own perceptions when things didn't add up." Valerie nodded. "That understanding will be crucial for what comes next. Nathan built his strategy on the assumption that you would remain psychologically trapped in the patterns he established, questioning yourself rather than him, prioritizing peace over justice, accepting his framing of reality." She laid out a folder of documents on her desk. "Speaking of what comes next, we've received a response to our filing. Nathan's attorney is requesting an expedited settlement conference, claiming significant professional opportunities that require prompt resolution of your marital assets." "The London position," I said immediately, remembering a conversation from months earlier when Nathan had mentioned a potential international expansion his firm was exploring. "He's being considered for heading their new London office. That's why he's rushing this divorce. He wants everything finalized before he relocates." "That timing works in our favor," Valerie observed. "The more pressure he feels to conclude this quickly, the more leverage we have. A man in a hurry makes mistakes." She checked her calendar. "I'll agree to the expedited conference on the condition that all financial discovery is complete. That gives us approximately 3 weeks to finalize our strategy." As I left Valerie's office, I received a text from an unknown number. "Megan, this is Cassidy Keller. I think we should talk. There are things you should know about Nathan." I stared at the message, a cold weight settling in my stomach. After weeks of silence from Nathan beyond terse legal communications through his attorney, this unexpected contact from his girlfriend felt like a trap. I forwarded the message to Valerie, who responded almost immediately, "Don't engage." This could be Nathan using her phone to gather information or provoke a reaction he can use against you. Her caution was reasonable, but something about the message nagged at me. The phrasing, "things you should know about Nathan," suggested Cassidy might be experiencing her own disillusionment. Had the charming, generous man who had swept her off her feet while I was caring for my dying father begun showing his true colors once he had her securely installed in his new life? Against Valerie's advice, I responded with a single question. "What things?" 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared for several minutes before a response finally came. "Financial inconsistencies. Lies about his divorce proceedings. Controlling. Behaviors I didn't expect. I'm not trying to cause problems, but I think we're both being manipulated." This time, I forwarded the exchange to both Valerie and Rebecca, asking for their guidance. Their responses came within moments of each other. Valerie: "Still advise caution. If you meet, only in public, bring a witness, record conversation where legally permitted." Rebecca: "Classic triangulation attempt or genuine warning from another victim. Either way, information is power. Proceed with extreme caution." After careful consideration, I replied to Cassidy, "I appreciate your reaching out. If you want to I can be at the Starbucks on 17th Street tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'll be with a colleague. The colleague would be Trevor Madison, a former law enforcement officer who now worked with Valerie's firm as an investigator and occasional security presence. Rebecca had offered to attend as well, her experience with financially abusive relationships, potentially valuable in assessing Cassidy's credibility. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. Was Cassidy genuinely reaching out woman to woman, having recognized patterns in Nathan's behavior? Or was this an elaborate setup orchestrated by Nathan to extract information about my legal strategy or provoke reactions he could use against me? Either scenario seemed plausible. The Nathan I had married was manipulative, but not malicious, at least not openly. But the Nathan who had emptied our accounts while I buried my father, who had planned his exit to maximize my vulnerability. That Nathan might be capable of using his girlfriend as an unwitting pawn in a more complex game. By morning, I had decided on my approach. I would listen more than speak, reveal nothing about my separate assets or legal strategy, and focus on gathering information rather than sharing it. If Cassidy was sincere, I might gain valuable insight into Nathan's current state of mind and plans. If she was being used as Nathan's proxy, I would give them nothing they could use against me. I prepared for this unexpected meeting. I realized how much had changed in the week since discovering Nathan's betrayal. The shocked, devastated woman who had stood frozen in our bedroom, Nathan's callous note trembling in her hand, had been replaced by someone more strategic, more guarded, more aware of the manipulative tactics that might be deployed against her. Rebecca had called it developing armor during our meeting, not the kind of hardened shell that prevents genuine connection, but the protective awareness that allows for engagement without exploitation. For 15 years I had moved through my marriage without that armor, vulnerable to Nathan's subtle manipulations and control tactics. Now, as I prepared to face the woman for whom he had discarded our life together, I felt that armor settling into place, not with bitterness or anger, but with a clear-eyed recognition of the battlefield I was entering and the tactics that might be employed there. Whatever Cassidy Keller wanted to tell me about Nathan, I was finally ready to hear it. Not as his wife, defined by my relationship to him, but as Megan Johnson, a woman reclaiming her independent identity one difficult conversation at a time. The Starbucks on 17th Street buzzed with typical afternoon activity, students hunched over laptops, business professionals conducting informal meetings, baristas calling out elaborate coffee orders. I arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a corner table that offered a clear view of both entrances while allowing Trevor to position himself inconspicuously at a nearby table. Rebecca was already seated at the counter, appearing to anyone else as just another professional enjoying an afternoon coffee break. I had dressed deliberately for this meeting, a simple but elegant black sheath dress with minimal jewelry, my hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Professional? Composed, neither trying to compete with Cassidy's youth nor diminish my own presence. At exactly 2 p.m. she walked through the door. In person, Cassidy Keller looked even younger than in her social media photos, barely out of college, with the luminous skin and bright eyes of someone whose adult life had only just begun. She wore business casual attire that spoke of careful curation on a limited budget, nice pieces assembled with an eye toward creating the right professional impression. I recognized the strategy because it had been mine at her age, before Nathan's. Income had made designer labels an expected part of my wardrobe. She spotted me immediately, hesitating briefly before approaching. Up close, I noticed signs of strain, slight shadows under her eyes, tension around her mouth, a nervousness in her movements that contradicted the confident professional image she was trying to project. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for meeting me." "Megan," I corrected gently, gesturing for her to sit. "And it's Johnson Harrington now, actually. I've reclaimed my maiden name." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Nathan said you never used your maiden name professionally." Nathan said many things that weren't entirely accurate, I replied evenly. Would you like a coffee? After Trevor returned with our drinks, keeping up the pretense of being my colleague by briefly joining us before returning to his separate table, Cassidy finally spoke. I know how this must look, she began, her fingers nervously tracing the lid of her cup. You probably think I'm some opportunistic homewrecker who targeted your husband, but it wasn't like that. Nathan told me your marriage had been over for years, that you were only staying together for appearances while living separate lives. The familiar script didn't surprise me. It was exactly what I would have expected Nathan to tell a young woman he was pursuing while still married. I understand, I said simply. Nathan is very convincing when he creates narratives that serve his purposes. Cassidy looked up sharply, studying my face. Whatever she saw there, perhaps the weary recognition of someone who had believed Nathan's narratives for far too long, seemed to confirm something for her. When did you start to question his version of events? I asked. She bit her lip, vulnerability momentarily replacing her professional composure. It started with little things after we moved in together. Comments that didn't align with what he'd told me previously. Reactions that seemed disproportionate when I asked about certain topics. She took a deep breath. Then, I accidentally saw an email from his attorney discussing strategy for hiding assets from you during the divorce. It referenced continuing. The approach that worked with the accounts and maintaining the narrative about the marriage being effectively over for years. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. When was this? 3 weeks ago. At first, I told myself I was misinterpreting it. Nathan had explained that you were being unreasonable about the divorce settlement, that you were trying to punish him for moving on. She looked down. But then, I found other things. Financial statements showing transfers I couldn't explain. A second phone he kept locked. Conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. This matched the pattern I knew all too well. Nathan, compartmentalizing. His life, controlling information, creating separate narratives for different audiences, but I remained cautious, aware this could still be an elaborate setup. Cassidy, I said carefully, why are you telling me this? What do you hope to achieve by meeting with me? Her response was immediate and direct. Information. Understanding. She straightened slightly. I have an MBA from Columbia and 3 years' experience at Goldman Sachs. Nathan hired me for my financial expertise, then systematically excluded me from meaningful work once our relationship began. Now I'm wondering if both my professional and personal judgments have been compromised. The raw honesty of her statement caught me off guard. This wasn't the manipulative ploy I had feared, nor a naive young woman seeking absolution. This was a professional who had recognized disconcerting patterns and was methodically seeking data to evaluate her situation. I believe Nathan is planning to leave the country after the divorce is finalized, she continued. He's mentioned the London office repeatedly, but last week I overheard him discussing property options in Singapore with someone on the phone. When I asked about it, he became defensive, then dismissive, saying it was just a contingency plan for a client. Singapore, not London. The significance wasn't lost on me. Singapore had no extradition treaty with the United States, while the UK did. If Nathan were concerned about potential legal consequences beyond our divorce, Singapore would offer protections. London couldn't. There's something else, Cassidy added, lowering her voice. Nathan has been moving money through a series of accounts I'm not supposed to know about. Small amounts at first, but increasing over the past 2 weeks. The pattern suggests he's preparing for something beyond a standard relocation. My mind raced with implications. If Nathan were engaged in financial improprieties beyond our marriage, perhaps at his firm, it would explain the accelerated timeline. For our divorce, his desire for quick settlement, and his potential exit strategy to a non-extradition country. Do you have documentation of these transfers? I asked carefully. Cassidy reached into her bag and removed a sealed envelope, sliding it across the table. Copies only. I've kept the originals secure. I'm not naive about the potential consequences of sharing this information. I didn't open the envelope, conscious of Trevor watching our interaction and Rebecca observing from her position at the counter. Why risk sharing this with me? Nathan could view this as betrayal. For the first time, real fear flashed across Cassidy's face. Because I'm starting to believe I don't know who Nathan really is. The man I thought I was building a future with wouldn't empty his wife's accounts while she buried her father. He wouldn't systematically isolate me from colleagues while claiming to champion my career. He wouldn't. She stopped abruptly. He wouldn't do that, Cassidy? Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. He wouldn't have a history of this pattern with other women. But he does. The revelation I hadn't anticipated, not just that Nathan had betrayed me, but that I might be one in a series of women who had served their purpose in his life before being discarded. I found a box in the back of his closet, Cassidy continued. It contained mementos from previous relationships, photographs, jewelry, letters, some dating back to before your marriage. He's kept trophies. I thought of the original engagement, ring I had found in his desk drawer, not misplaced during our move as he had claimed, but deliberately preserved as part of this collection. A cold feeling settled in my chest. There were journals, too, Cassidy added. Detailed accounts of relationships, categorized like case studies. Your name was on one. So were others, Caroline, Jennifer, Alexis, all described in the same methodical language, all following similar trajectories from adoration to evaluation to disposal. The clinical term sent a chill through me. Disposal. As if we had been assets to be leveraged, then liquidated when our value diminished or our utility ended. How did you find all this? I asked, suspicion briefly returning. It seemed too convenient, too much like the plot of a psychological thriller. I'm a financial analyst by training, Cassidy replied with unexpected steel in her voice. When numbers don't align, I investigate. When patterns emerge, I follow them to their source. It's what Nathan hired me for originally, before he decided my primary value was decorative. The bitterness in her tone rang true, the frustration of a gifted professional reduced to an accessory. I had felt that same diminishment over years rather than months, but the pattern was identical. I started with the financial discrepancies, she explained. Transfers that didn't match his explained income. Accounts that appeared and disappeared from statements. Once I began looking, other inconsistencies became apparent. Schedule gaps that didn't align with his claimed whereabouts. Contacts he deleted from his phone after certain calls, the separate email accounts. She held my gaze steadily. I didn't set out to investigate Nathan. I just couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that the man I was living with wasn't who he claimed to be. The parallels to my own gradual awakening were striking. The difference was timing. Cassidy had recognized Nathan's patterns within months, while I had submerged my doubts beneath layers of accommodation and rationalization for years. What do you want from me? I asked directly. Confirmation, she replied without hesitation. I need to know if I'm correctly interpreting what I've found or if I'm becoming paranoid. And she hesitated. Guidance. You survived 15 years with him. You must have strategies for managing the manipulation. The request startled me. Cassidy wasn't seeking an ally against Nathan or offering to become mine. She was approaching me as someone with specialized knowledge, expertise, gained through my years of navigating Nathan's psychological landscape. Do you love him? I asked, the question emerging before I could censor it. Cassidy didn't answer immediately, considering the question with a thoroughness I respected. I thought I did, she finally said. Now I'm not sure if I loved him or the version of himself he crafted specifically for me. The Nathan who championed my career, who seemed to value my intelligence, who treated me as an equal partner. That man was intoxicating, but I'm increasingly certain he doesn't actually exist. Her insight surpassed what had taken me years to recognize. The Nathan I had fallen in love with, the one who had once looked at me with genuine appreciation for my financial acumen, who had talked about building an empire together as true partners, had gradually transformed once I was securely committed. Or perhaps he had never truly existed at all, just a carefully constructed persona designed to acquire what he needed at each phase of his life. "Are you planning to leave him?" I asked. "Not yet," she replied with surprising candor. "I need more information first. A complete understanding of what I'm dealing with and a secure exit strategy. Nathan can be unpredictable when his control is threatened." The statement raised immediate concern. Has he been physically threatening? Not exactly, but there have been moments, flashes of something cold when I question him about certain topics, a grip on my arm that lasted slightly too long, ways of physically positioning himself when we argue that feel intentionally intimidating. Warning signs I had never experienced with Nathan, or perhaps had subconsciously avoided triggering by becoming increasingly compliant over the years. "If you feel unsafe, you need to leave immediately," I said firmly. "No information is worth your physical security." Cassidy shook her head. "I don't think he would actually hurt me. It's more subtle than that, creating an atmosphere where compliance feels like the only comfortable option." The description was disturbingly familiar, the same atmosphere that had gradually permeated our marriage, leading me to modify my opinions, soften my objections, and ultimately surrender my financial autonomy to maintain peace. "I know how to create distance without triggering his suspicion," Cassidy assured me. "I've already secured a separate apartment using my maiden name and moved critical documents to a safe location. I have a job offer in Chicago that Nathan knows nothing about. I just need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make my final move." Her methodical approach impressed me, particularly given her youth. At 26, Cassidy exhibited a clarity and strategic thinking that I had only developed after my world imploded. "The information you've shared changes things," I acknowledged. "Not just for my divorce proceedings, but potentially regarding Nathan's professional activities. If he's preparing to leave the country with concealed assets, there may be regulatory issues beyond our marital separation." Cassidy nodded. "That's my assessment as well. The amounts and patterns of transfers suggest something beyond divorce planning. I think Nathan may be involved in financial improprieties at Montgomery Adams." The implication was significant. If Nathan were engaged in misconduct at his firm, perhaps the same creative accounting that had allowed him to present inflated income during our marriage, it would explain his desperate rush to finalize our divorce and establish himself outside U.S. jurisdiction. "I should share something with you," I said after careful consideration. "Nathan didn't leave me as financially devastated as he believes. My father anticipated this scenario and helped establish protections I knew nothing about until after Nathan's departure." I watched her face closely, looking for any reaction that might suggest this meeting was indeed a setup to extract exactly this information. But Cassidy's expression showed only professional interest, not calculating satisfaction. "Smart man, your father," she observed. "Nathan mentioned you'd been making frequent trips to Wisconsin for his care." He framed it as an irritation, an inconvenience to his social schedule. The casual cruelty of this perspective on my father's terminal illness struck me anew. While I had been balancing grief and caretaking responsibilities, Nathan had been viewing my father's death primarily as a disruption to his networking opportunities, and ultimately as the perfect distraction for his calculated exit. My father saw something in Nathan that I couldn't, I acknowledged. Or wouldn't. The protective measures he put in place have given me options Nathan never anticipated. Cassidy smiled slightly. Good. Nathan counts on having the upper hand. Through superior information and preparation, discovering you have resources he didn't account for will be psychologically significant for him. Her analytical framing of Nathan's potential reaction revealed her own professional detachment, a quality that had probably attracted Nathan initially and might now help protect her as she planned her exit. Our conversation continued for another hour, exchanging perspectives on Nathan's patterns and comparing notes on the inconsistencies we had each observed. Despite the bizarre circumstances, I found myself appreciating Cassidy's intellect and perceptiveness. In different circumstances, we might have been colleagues rather than women connected by the same manipulative man. As our meeting concluded, Cassidy handed me a second envelope. My direct contact information, including the secure email account Nathan doesn't know about. I've also included access credentials for a cloud storage location where I've backed up the documentation I mentioned. If anything happens, or if Nathan somehow discovers I've met with you, this ensures the information won't be lost. The precaution was sobering. Do you genuinely believe you might be at risk? Cassidy considered the question carefully. Probably not physically, but Nathan is extremely controlling about information. If he discovered I was sharing details about his financial activities with his soon-to-be ex-wife, she shrugged. Let's just say I prefer to have contingencies in place. We parted with an awkward but genuine handshake, neither friends nor enemies but allies of circumstance, connected by our shared experience of Nathan's manipulation. As Cassidy left the coffee shop, Rebecca joined me at the table, Trevor remaining at his post to ensure Cassidy wasn't meeting with anyone afterward. Well, Rebecca asked, your assessment? She's telling the truth, I replied with certainty. Not just about Nathan's current activities, but about her own position. She's recognized the pattern faster than I did and is already planning her exit. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. Her body language supported that conclusion. No indicators of deception I could detect, though Nathan may have sent her without her knowledge of his full agenda. No, I said, surprising myself with my conviction. Cassidy is too smart for that. She's already playing a careful game of appearing compliant while gathering information. She knows exactly what she's doing, both in meeting me and in her strategy for leaving him. Then we need to move quickly, Rebecca advised. This information about potential financial improprieties at his firm and preparations to leave the country changes our timeline. If Nathan is planning to flee to Singapore with hidden assets once your divorce is finalized, Valerie needs to adjust her approach immediately. As we left the coffee shop, I felt an unexpected kinship with the young woman who had supposedly replaced me in Nathan's life. Far from being my enemy, Cassidy had provided crucial insights that might prove decisive in the coming confrontation. She had also demonstrated a clear-eyed recognition of Nathan's manipulative patterns that had taken me years to acknowledge. Most importantly, she had confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Nathan's betrayal wasn't just the end of a marriage, but potentially part of a larger pattern of deception that extended into his professional life. The stakes had risen considerably, not just for my divorce settlement, but possibly for criminal liability that might explain Nathan's accelerated timeline and apparent exit strategy. The unexpected encounter had indeed changed my perspective, though not in the way I could have anticipated. I had entered that coffee shop prepared to face the other woman with composed dignity. I had left with an ally whose insights might prove crucial in the battle ahead, and the unsettling realization that Nathan's calculated exploitation might extend far beyond our marriage. This changes everything, Valerie declared, spreading Cassidy's documents across her conference table the following morning. Rebecca and I sat opposite her, watching as she methodically reviewed the evidence of Nathan's suspicious financial activities. The materials Cassidy had provided were comprehensive: bank statements showing transfers to overseas accounts, emails discussing property options in Singapore, and most damning fragments of communications suggesting irregularities in client account management at Montgomery Adams. If even half of this is accurate, Valerie continued, we're no longer just dealing with marital asset division. These transactions suggest potential securities fraud, which would fall under federal jurisdiction. Should we be contacting the SEC? I asked, still processing the implications of what Cassidy had uncovered. Valerie's expression turned thoughtful. Not yet. First, we need to verify this independently. If Nathan discovers we're exploring this angle, he'll accelerate whatever exit strategy he's developing. Rebecca leaned forward, studying a particularly complex series of transfers. These movement patterns are classic layering, running money through multiple accounts to obscure its origins and destination. It's sophisticated enough to suggest this isn't Nathan's first attempt at concealing assets. The revelation aligned with what Cassidy had shared about finding evidence of Nathan's pattern with previous women. Perhaps his approach to relationships mirrored his financial methodology, extracting maximum value before moving assets elsewhere, leaving nothing but devastation behind. We need a comprehensive strategy, Valerie decided. One that addresses both the divorce proceedings and these potential financial improprieties. Each element impacts the other, and timing will be critical. For the next 3 hours, we developed a multi-phase plan that felt more like a military operation than a divorce strategy. Valerie would continue the divorce proceedings as planned, maintaining the appearance that I remained financially devastated by Nathan's actions. Meanwhile, Rebecca would work with financial forensic specialists to verify Cassidy's information without triggering alerts that might warn Nathan he was being investigated. The settlement conference is scheduled for next Thursday, Valerie noted, checking her calendar. That gives us 9 days to verify this information and determine how to leverage it most effectively. What about Cassidy? I asked. If Nathan discovers she's shared this information, she could be at risk. I've already arranged for discreet security monitoring, Valerie assured me. A former client of mine runs a personal protection service. They'll maintain surveillance without her knowledge, just as a precaution. The thoroughness of these preparations underscored the potential danger of our situation. Nathan wasn't just a husband who had betrayed his marriage vows. He was potentially a sophisticated financial criminal preparing to flee the country with millions in concealed assets. There's another angle we should consider, Rebecca suggested. Nathan's professional colleagues. If he's engaged in financial misconduct at Montgomery Adams, he's likely created a narrative there similar to the one he constructed in your marriage, positioning himself as the responsible party while obscuring his actual activities. It was a perspective I hadn't considered. Just as Nathan had cultivated an image within our social circle as the devoted husband supporting his wife's charitable interests, he had undoubtedly created a carefully managed professional persona that masked his true activities. I might have a contact who could help with that, I said slowly, an idea forming. Jason Winters from Meridian Partners. He and Nathan competed for clients in the same circles, but Jason always maintained higher ethical standards. Nathan dismissed him as too conservative to achieve top-tier success. Could you reach out to him without raising suspicions? Valerie asked. I nodded. Jason and I maintained a cordial relationship independent of Nathan. He reached out after my father's death with a genuine condolence message, unlike most of Nathan's colleagues who seemed to take their social cues exclusively from him. I could arrange a coffee meeting that would appear to be nothing more than reconnecting during a difficult time. Perfect, Valerie approved. Information from a professional competitor might provide context for these financial maneuvers that Cassidy wouldn't have access to. As our planning session concluded, I felt a strange combination of dread and determination. The stakes had escalated far beyond what I had initially imagined when finding Nathan's callous note on my nightstand. This wasn't just about reclaiming my financial security or dignity after betrayal. It potentially involved exposing criminal activity that could have consequences for Nathan far beyond our divorce. One last thing before we separate, Valerie said, gathering the documents into a secure folder. Nathan will almost certainly attempt to contact you directly before the settlement conference. He'll want to gauge your emotional state, assess your knowledge, and potentially manipulate you into a less advantageous position. I've maintained complete silence since discovering his betrayal, I confirmed. All communication has been through attorneys. He'll escalate as the conference approaches, Valerie predicted. When manipulation through intermediaries fails, men like Nathan typically attempt direct emotional leverage. Be prepared for anything. Pleas for understanding, revisionist history about your marriage, even threats veiled as concerns. The warning resonated with unexpected potency. Despite everything I had learned about Nathan's calculated betrayal, despite the evidence suggesting he had been planning his exit long before my father's illness provided the perfect opportunity, part of me still retained emotional vulnerability to the man I had loved for 15 years. I understand, I assured her, though inwardly I questioned my ability to remain detached if Nathan deployed the considerable charm and emotional intelligence that had once captivated me. Rebecca seemed to sense my uncertainty. Consider role-playing. Potential scenarios, she suggested. Practice responses to the most emotionally triggering approaches he might use. The more prepared you are for his tactics, the less effective they'll be. That evening, alone in what had once been our guest room, I did exactly that, imagining Nathan's most likely angles of approach and formulating responses that would appear appropriately vulnerable while revealing nothing of our emerging strategy. Would he attempt to reframe our marriage as mutually unfulfilling, suggesting we had grown apart, rather than acknowledging his calculated betrayal? Would he position himself as the victim of bad timing, claiming he had planned a more considerate exit before my father's illness forced his hand? Or would he simply attempt to overwhelm me with technical financial details, counting on the same dismissive attitude toward my financial acumen that had characterized much of our marriage? The exercise proved unexpectedly therapeutic, allowing me to anticipate emotional triggers and develop protective responses before encountering them in real time. By mentally rehearsing these scenarios, I was reclaiming control of the narrative, not just for the impending legal proceedings, but for my own emotional healing. My predicted contact from Nathan came sooner than expected. The following morning, as I worked from home on proposals for 2 new consulting clients, my phone displayed his name for the first time since discovering his betrayal. Megan, his message read, "This legal approach is unnecessary and costly for both of us. I've always respected your intelligence and practicality. Can we meet privately to discuss a reasonable resolution before lawyers drain what resources remain? I have a settlement proposal that acknowledges your contributions to our marriage." The message hit every note Valerie had predicted, appealing to my vanity, intelligence, and practicality, suggesting concern for my financial welfare, lawyers draining resources, and implying generosity in acknowledging my contributions, while subtly reinforcing that the marriage's achievements belonged primarily to him. I waited 2 hours before responding with carefully calibrated vulnerability. "I'm still processing everything that's happened, Nathan. I'm not ready for a face-to-face meeting yet. You can send any proposal through Valerie." His response came immediately. "I understand you're hurt. I handled things poorly. But Megan, we built 15 years together. Doesn't that deserve a conversation without legal filters? The proposal I have in mind doesn't fit standard templates. It's designed specifically for your needs and preferences, which attorneys often overlook in favor of conventional approaches. The transparent attempt to separate me from my legal counsel might have seemed clumsy if I hadn't been forewarned, but I recognized it as a classic isolation tactic, the same approach Nathan had used throughout our marriage when attempting to prevent me from seeking outside perspectives on his decisions. I forwarded the exchange to Valerie with a brief note. "Starting exactly as you predicted." Her response was equally concise. "Perfect. Maintain exactly this tone. Hurt but not hostile, receptive but hesitant. Let's see what he offers next." Nathan's third message arrived that evening. "I have a brief window tomorrow morning before meetings. Coffee at Café Laurent at 9. Just 30 minutes. You deserve to hear my perspective directly, and I want to understand your priorities for moving forward. No attorneys, no agendas, just honest conversation. Café Laurent. where we had celebrated our 10th anniversary. The location choice wasn't accidental, but designed to evoke memories of happier times and emotional connection. The brief window before meetings similarly communicated importance. He was making time in his busy schedule, while creating artificial scarcity, only 30 minutes available, to pressure acceptance. After consulting with Valerie, I responded, "I can meet briefly, but I'll be bringing a friend for support. This isn't about legal strategy, just emotional grounding during a difficult conversation." This deviation from his proposed format, a private meeting where he could fully deploy his persuasive tactics, would force Nathan to either accept conditions he hadn't planned for or reveal his true agenda by canceling. His response came after an unusually long delay. "I was hoping for a private conversation about personal matters, perhaps another time when you're more comfortable meeting one-on-one. In the meantime, I've instructed my attorney to send a revised settlement proposal tomorrow. Please review it with an open mind." The retreat was telling. Nathan had no interest in an honest conversation if witnesses would be present. His priority wasn't understanding my perspective, but securing an opportunity to manipulate without interference. Valerie confirmed this assessment when I shared the exchange. Classic. He wanted you isolated from both legal counsel and emotional support. When that failed, he immediately pivoted to a formal proposal through attorneys, exactly what he claimed to be avoiding. The revised settlement proposal arrived the following morning, and as Valerie had predicted, it contained only minimal improvements from the previous offer. Slightly increased monthly support for 1 year, rather than the lump sum payment, and a small percentage of Nathan's reported retirement funds, the house, investment accounts, and majority of assets would remain with him, while I would receive just enough to maintain basic stability while seeking full-time employment. "This is intentionally inadequate," Valerie noted during our review call. "He's establishing a negotiating position that makes even modest improvements seem generous by comparison." "Should we counter?" I asked. "Not yet," she advised. "Let him believe you're considering this offer, perhaps with reluctance but without outright rejection. The longer he believes you remain financially dependent and legally naive, the more complete our advantage when we finally reveal our full position." Meanwhile, Rebecca's team had been quietly verifying Cassidy's information about Nathan's suspicious financial activities. 3 days after our planning meeting, she requested an urgent conference call with Valerie and me. "We've confirmed the overseas transfers and property inquiries in Singapore," she reported without preamble. "But there's more. We've identified a pattern of client fund mismanagement dating back approximately 18 months, coinciding with Nathan's partnership promotion at Montgomery Adams." "What kind of mismanagement?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Sophisticated skimming operations," Rebecca explained. "Small percentages diverted from high-value client accounts, concealed through manipulated reporting that clients wouldn't detect without forensic analysis. The total amount appears to be approaching $3 million. The figure shocked me into momentary silence. I had expected evidence of financial impropriety, but not at this scale. "This explains the accelerated divorce timeline and Singapore preparations," Valerie observed. "He's planning to disappear with these funds once the divorce is finalized, and his affairs appear to be in order." "Have you confirmed this independently of Cassidy's documentation?" I asked, still processing the implications. "Yes," Rebecca assured me. "My team accessed public records and regulatory filings that support her information without revealing our interest. We've also verified the Singapore property inquiries through a contact in international real estate." The plan we had developed now required significant revision. This wasn't just about strategically revealing my separate assets during divorce proceedings. It potentially involved federal securities violations that could result in criminal charges. "We need to approach the SEC," Valerie stated, the lawyer in her recognizing the ethical and legal obligations this discovery created. "But timing remains critical. If Nathan receives any indication of regulatory interest before we've secured Your position in the divorce, he'll likely accelerate his exit strategy. What about his firm? I asked. Montgomery Adams has a reputation for rigorous compliance. Could they really be unaware of these activities? That's unclear, Rebecca responded. Nathan's partnership position would give him significant autonomy with certain client accounts. This could be individual action rather than firm-wide misconduct. The distinction mattered, not just legally, but personally. I had met many of Nathan's colleagues and their families over the years, attended their children's birthday parties, celebrated their promotions. If Nathan's activities were isolated, revealing them might protect innocent professionals from being blindsided by potential regulatory actions. I met with Jason Winters yesterday, I informed them, transitioning to my own intelligence gathering. Without revealing anything specific, I mentioned Nathan's unusual interest in Singapore relocation. Jason's reaction was telling, immediate concern rather than simple curiosity. Did he elaborate? Valerie asked. He mentioned rumors of irregularities in some of Montgomery Adams' client reporting, specifically accounts under Nathan's management. Apparently, compliance officers had raised questions that were repeatedly deflected through various procedural maneuvers. This aligned perfectly with Cassidy's information and Rebecca's verification. Nathan wasn't just planning to leave me with nothing. He was preparing to flee potential criminal liability with millions in misappropriated funds. This dramatically changes our approach to the settlement conference, Valerie declared. We now have 3 distinct advantages: your separate assets that Nathan knows nothing about, Cassidy's insider information about his current activities, and evidence of potential criminal misconduct that could be shared with regulatory authorities. How do we deploy these most effectively? I asked, recognizing that the coming confrontation required precision timing. Valerie outlined a revised strategy. We begin the conference appearing exactly as Nathan expects, financially vulnerable, emotionally fragile, accompanied only by legal counsel. We allow him to present his inadequate settlement offer with his typical condescension. Then we systematically dismantle his position in carefully planned phases. The approach she described was both strategic and psychologically astute, designed not just to secure a favorable settlement, but to systematically reveal Nathan's miscalculations while maintaining legal and ethical boundaries. The goal isn't just financial equity, Valerie emphasized. It's establishing that Nathan's entire exit strategy was built on fundamental misconceptions about your resources, knowledge, and resolve. As our call concluded, I felt a strange combination of anticipation and solemnity. The coming confrontation would represent more than the formal dissolution of my marriage. It would be the moment Nathan finally encountered the consequences of his calculated betrayal. For 15 years, I had gradually accommodated his manipulation, doubted my own perceptions, and surrendered my financial autonomy in service of what I believed was mutual success. The settlement conference would mark my complete reclamation of personal agency, not through emotional reaction or vindictiveness, but through strategic preparation and clear-eyed recognition of exactly who Nathan was and what he had attempted to do. There's one more piece to consider, Rebecca added before we disconnected. Cassidy. If her assistance proves decisive in this confrontation, Nathan will eventually realize her role. That could put her at risk, particularly given what we now know about the scale of his financial activities. The concern was valid. Cassidy had already demonstrated considerable courage in sharing what she had discovered, potentially endangering her own security in the process. I'll contact her through the secure channel she provided, I decided. She deserves to know that her information has been verified and that we're proceeding with a plan that may have significant consequences for Nathan. After ending the call, I composed a carefully worded message to Cassidy, providing no specific details about our strategy but confirming that her information had proven accurate and actionable. I also included contact information for Valerie's security consultant, suggesting she consider additional protective measures as the situation evolved. With 7 days remaining before the settlement conference, our team intensified preparations, refining strategy, anticipating potential counterarguments, and ensuring every piece of documentation was irrefutably accurate. Nathan had spent months planning his exit. We had days to prepare our response. But what we lacked in time, we made up for in precision and motivation. On the eve of the conference, I returned to the journal where I had listed what I had gained, lost and compromised during 15 years with Nathan. To the final column, what I compromised, I added one more entry. The belief that love precludes accountability. Tomorrow, Nathan would discover the full cost of that misconception. The morning of the settlement conference dawned crisp and clear, Denver's autumn sunshine creating a deceptive sense of optimism. I dressed with deliberate care, a charcoal gray suit that projected professional competence without ostentation, minimal jewelry, hair styled simply but precisely. Nothing about my appearance would suggest the financial devastation Nathan believed he had inflicted. Remember, Valerie advised as we reviewed final preparations in her office before heading to the conference. The greatest advantage in negotiation is when your opponent fundamentally misunderstands your position. Nathan believes you're operating from desperation. Let him maintain that illusion until the precise moment we choose to dispel it. Rebecca arrived for a brief strategy alignment before departing for her own office, where she would remain on standby for the second phase of our plan. Financial documentation is prepared and verified, she confirmed. Everything is organized for maximum impact when revealed. The conference was scheduled at a neutral location, a mediation center downtown that provided professional meeting spaces for sensitive negotiations. As Valerie and I entered the Modernist building, I felt a strange sense of calm descend. After weeks of preparation, months of emotional turmoil, and years of subtle manipulation within my marriage, this moment represented a definitive turning point, not just in legal proceedings, but in reclaiming my personal narrative. Nathan and his attorney, Bradford Mills, were already seated in the conference room when we arrived. Nathan looked exactly as I remembered, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, his expression a carefully calibrated blend of confidence and appropriate solemnity for the occasion. Our eyes met briefly as Valerie and I took our seats on the opposite side of the conference table. I detected a momentary flicker of something unidentifiable. Perhaps surprise at my composed appearance, when he had likely anticipated visible distress. The mediator, a distinguished older woman named Judge Eleanor Hoffman, retired, opened the proceedings with a brief overview of the process and objectives. This conference is an opportunity to resolve your dissolution matters privately, equitably, and with minimal acrimony, she explained. I understand Mr. Harrington has prepared a comprehensive settlement proposal as a starting point for our discussion. Bradford Mills, Nathan's attorney, immediately took charge, distributing copies of their settlement offer with practiced efficiency. Judge Hoffman, Mrs. Harrington, Ms. Rivera, what we've prepared represents a fair and reasonable division of assets that acknowledges both the duration of the marriage and the respective contributions of each party. I noticed Nathan watching me closely as I received my copy, no doubt anticipating visible relief at the marginally improved terms from his previous offer. The document proposed slightly more generous monthly support for 2 years, rather than 1, and offered a 25% share of his disclosed retirement accounts, still far below what Colorado law typically provided after a 15-year marriage, but designed to appear generous compared to his initial proposal. Mr. Mills, Judge Hoffman inquired after reviewing the document, this proposal indicates Mr. Harrington would retain ownership of the primary residence, all investment accounts, and 75% of retirement assets, while Mrs. Harrington would receive temporary support and a minority portion of retirement funds. Given the length of the marriage, could you elaborate on your rationale for this division? Mills launched into a carefully constructed narrative about Nathan's primary contribution to marital assets and my limited professional activity in recent years, suggesting that equity required acknowledging the disparate financial contributions to our marital estate. Throughout this presentation, I maintained attentive neutrality, neither displaying distress nor challenging the characterization of our marriage. Valerie took minimal notes, occasionally glancing at me with well-rehearsed concern, reinforcing Nathan's perception that we were operating from a position of weakness. When Mills concluded, Judge Hoffman turned to us. "Ms. Rivera, would your client like to respond to this proposal?" "Yes, Your Honor," Valerie replied, her tone measured. "Before addressing specific terms, we'd like to clarify several factual matters regarding marital assets that appear to be misrepresented in Mr. Harrington's proposal." Nathan shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair, the first hint of potential discomfort as Valerie departed from the defensive posture he had anticipated. "Specifically," Valerie continued, "Mr. Harrington's financial affidavit fails to account for several substantial withdrawals from joint accounts that occurred while my client was attending to her father's funeral arrangements in Wisconsin. We've prepared documentation of these unauthorized transfers, which significantly impact the marital estate valuation underlying this proposal." She distributed the first packet of materials we had prepared, comprehensive records of Nathan's systematic emptying of our joint accounts, the unauthorized second mortgage on our home, and the liquidation of joint investments, all meticulously dated to correspond with my father's funeral services. Judge Hoffman reviewed these materials with professional inscrutability, while Nathan maintained his composed facade. Only someone who knew him as intimately as I did would recognize the subtle tightening around his eyes, the first sign of his carefully controlled anger. "Mr. Mills," Judge Hoffman inquired, "were you aware of these transactions when preparing your settlement proposal?" Mills glanced at Nathan before responding. "Your Honor, the timing of certain financial restructuring decisions was unfortunate, but these were standard account consolidations Mr. Harrington believed were previously discussed with his wife. Any appearance of impropriety is simply a misunderstanding, resulting from Mrs. Harrington's unavailability during a difficult family period." The audacity of this reframing, characterizing his systematic asset stripping as standard account consolidations and suggesting my father's death was merely an inconvenient timing issue, might have provoked emotional response in the past. Now, it simply confirmed everything I had come to understand about the man I had married. "If I may, Your Honor," Valerie interjected, her tone remaining professionally measured. "These weren't minor account adjustments. Mr. Harrington transferred over $840,000 from joint accounts to individual accounts in his name only, took out a $450,000 second mortgage on their shared residence without Mrs. Harrington's knowledge or consent, and liquidated approximately $1.2 million in joint investment holdings, all within a 72-hour period coinciding precisely with James Johnson's funeral services." Judge Hoffman turned to Nathan directly. "Mr. Harrington, these are significant financial maneuvers to undertake unilaterally during your wife's absence. Can you help me understand the urgency that prevented consulting with her?" For the first time, Nathan spoke, his voice carrying the smooth, authoritative tone that had once captivated boardrooms and social gatherings alike. "Your Honor, Megan had increasingly delegated financial management to me throughout our marriage. These moves were part of a long-planned portfolio restructuring strategy that unfortunately coincided with her father's passing. The timing was regrettable, but the decisions were consistent with our established financial management practices. It was a masterful performance, acknowledging the troubling timing while creating a revisionist history of our financial relationship that positioned his unilateral actions as consistent with established patterns. Had I not spent weeks preparing for exactly this narrative, it might have induced the familiar self-doubt that had characterized so much of our marriage." "Mrs. Harrington?" Judge Hoffman inquired, turning to me directly. "Would you characterize your financial arrangement with your husband as one where you had delegated management authority to him for such significant decisions?" This was my cue. The moment to begin our carefully orchestrated revelation. I met Nathan's gaze directly for the first time since entering the room. "No, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steadier than even I had expected. While Nathan often presented financial decisions as mutually determined after they were already executed, I never authorized him to empty our accounts, mortgage our home without my knowledge, or liquidate our investments. Given my MBA from Northwestern and professional background in financial consulting, such delegation would have been fundamentally out of character. Nathan's expression remained composed, but I noticed his right hand tighten slightly around his pen, a subtle tell I recognized from countless business dinners when a conversation wasn't proceeding according to his expectations. Furthermore, I continued, these unilateral actions coincided not just with my father's funeral, but with Nathan's developing relationship with Cassidy Keller, a 26-year-old financial analyst at his firm, with whom he secured an apartment lease, the very day I was lighting a candle at my father's memorial service. The strategic introduction of Cassidy achieved its intended purpose, shifting the narrative from financial restructuring to deliberate betrayal and raising questions about Nathan's motivations that his professional demeanor couldn't easily dismiss. "Your Honor," Mills interjected quickly, "Mrs. Harrington's personal grievances about the marriage's dissolution aren't relevant to equitable asset division. The timing of certain events may appear unfortunate, but—" "With respect, Mr. Mills," Valerie interrupted, "the timing isn't merely unfortunate, it's deliberate and calculated. Mr. Harrington systematically stripped joint assets while his wife was at her most vulnerable, then presented her with a fait accompli upon her return from her father's funeral. This represents not just marital misconduct, but potentially fraudulent financial behavior that directly impacts asset division considerations." For the next hour, Valerie methodically presented documentation of Nathan's financial maneuvers, each exhibit further undermining his narrative of routine portfolio management. Throughout this presentation, I maintained composed attention, offering clarification when necessary, but otherwise allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Nathan's confidence visibly eroded as the presentation continued, his practiced charm giving way to increasingly transparent irritation. This wasn't proceeding according to his script. The grieving, financially devastated wife, gratefully accepting whatever crumbs he offered, was instead participating in a methodical dismantling of his carefully constructed narrative. Judge Hoffman reviewed the materials with growing concern. "Mr. Mills, these financial maneuvers appear problematic under Colorado marital property laws. At minimum, they suggest a pattern of dissipation that would typically result in those assets being added back into the marital estate for division purposes, potentially with punitive adjustments given the apparent intentionality." Mills leaned over to confer briefly with Nathan, their hushed exchange carrying obvious tension. When he addressed the judge again, his approach had shifted noticeably. "Your Honor, while we dispute the characterization of these transactions, we recognize that certain aspects of the timing could create unfortunate impressions. My client is prepared to offer a revised settlement that more generously acknowledges Mrs. Harrington's contributions to the marriage and addresses concerns about recent account management." This was the pivot we had anticipated, Nathan attempting to salvage his advantage by making incremental concessions that still left him with the lion's share of assets while creating the appearance of reasonable compromise. "We would be interested in hearing this revised proposal," Valerie replied, maintaining our appearance of cautious receptivity. Mills outlined new terms that included slightly increased support duration, a 40% share of retirement accounts, and a modest cash settlement from the proceeds of the second mortgage, still grossly inadequate given both Colorado law and Nathan's financial misconduct, but designed to appear significant compared to his original offer. "Before we respond to this revised proposal," Valerie said after Mills concluded, "there's another matter that significantly impacts our consideration of equitable distribution." She nodded to me, signaling the transition to our second phase. This was the moment we had carefully prepared for, the strategic revelation of the separate assets my father had helped establish. Your Honor, I began, while Mr. Harrington believed he had left me financially devastated, there's relevant information about my separate property that fundamentally alters the financial landscape of these proceedings. I could feel Nathan's heightened attention as Valerie distributed our second packet of materials, comprehensive documentation of my separate trust, the Johnson Construction ownership shares, and the Johnson Financial Consulting LLC that had been properly established and maintained as separate property throughout our marriage. These assets, Valerie explained, were established with Mrs. Harrington's inheritance from her maternal grandmother, transferred through her father's careful estate planning, and maintained as separate property throughout the marriage. They were properly reported on tax returns and never commingled with marital assets. The shift in the room's energy was palpable. Judge Hoffman reviewed the documentation with interest, while Nathan's expression transformed from controlled irritation to genuine shock as he processed the implications. His entire strategy had been predicated on my financial desperation, a fundamental miscalculation that was now being revealed in exquisite detail. Mrs. Harrington, Judge Hoffman inquired, why are you just now introducing these separate assets? They weren't included in your initial financial disclosures. Because they're not subject to division, Your Honor, Valerie answered smoothly. As separate property maintained distinct from marital assets, they don't factor into equitable distribution calculations. We're introducing them now simply to provide complete transparency regarding Mrs. Harrington's financial position as we evaluate settlement proposals. The legal reasoning was sound, but the psychological impact was the true purpose of this revelation. Nathan had believed he held absolute leverage through financial control. Discovering I had resources he knew nothing about fundamentally destabilized his negotiating position. For the first time, Nathan's composure genuinely slipped. This is impossible, he stated flatly, addressing me directly rather than through his attorney. You never mentioned these assets throughout our marriage. Just as you never mentioned your relationship with Cassidy Keller, the second mortgage on our home, or your plans to empty our joint accounts, I replied evenly. We all have our oversights. The measured response, devoid of the emotional distress he had expected, seemed to unsettle Nathan more than anger would have. He turned to Mills, their whispered consultation taking on a newly urgent quality. When they finished, Mills addressed Judge Hoffman. Your Honor, we'll need time to verify these alleged separate assets and assess their impact on our settlement position. Of course, Valerie agreed magnanimously. Though while Mr. Harrington's team conducts that verification, there's one additional factor that may influence their settlement considerations. This was the transition to our final phase, the revelation of Nathan's potential financial improprieties beyond our marriage. We had debated extensively whether to introduce this element, weighing legal and ethical considerations against strategic advantage. Ultimately, we had decided that creating awareness without making explicit threats struck the appropriate balance. Mrs. Harrington has recently become aware of concerning financial patterns that extend beyond marital accounts, Valerie continued carefully. While not directly relevant to these proceedings, they raise regulatory compliance questions that could potentially impact the timeline for resolution. She distributed our final packet, a carefully redacted version of the documentation Cassidy had provided and Rebecca's team had verified, showing patterns of suspicious transfers without explicitly alleging criminal activity. The effect on Nathan was immediate and dramatic. His face drained of color as he recognized account numbers and transaction patterns that could only have come from someone with inside access to his current financial activities. His eyes darted to mine with genuine alarm, likely calculating how I could possibly have obtained this information. Mills reviewed the materials with professional concern, clearly recognizing potential regulatory issues beyond the scope of divorce proceedings. Your Honor, these documents appear to reference Mr. Harrington's professional activities, which are entirely separate from marital asset considerations and inappropriate for inclusion in these proceedings. We're not suggesting they're relevant to asset division, Valerie clarified smoothly. We're simply providing context for Mrs. Harrington's settlement priorities, which include timely resolution without unnecessary complications that might arise from tangential matters. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. We were aware of Nathan's potentially criminal financial activities and his plans to flee to Singapore, but were offering a path to divorce resolution that didn't necessarily involve regulatory authorities if he cooperated with a fair settlement. Judge Hoffman, recognizing the subtext of this exchange, suggested a brief recess for both parties to confer privately. As Nathan and Mills exited to a separate conference room, the judge gave me a measured look that suggested she understood more than she was acknowledging officially. Once alone with Valerie, I finally released the breath I felt I'd been holding throughout the carefully choreographed presentation. He was genuinely shocked, I observed. Not just concerned or irritated, truly blindsided. That was the goal, Valerie confirmed with professional satisfaction. Nathan built his entire strategy on fundamental misconceptions, that you were financially devastated, legally naive, and completely in the dark about his current activities. We've systematically dismantled each of those pillars. When we reconvened 30 minutes later, the change in Nathan's demeanor was striking. The confident, controlling presence had been replaced by someone visibly calculating damage control options. Mills requested an opportunity to present a, substantially, revised settlement framework that represented a good faith effort to achieve equitable resolution without protracted litigation. The terms he outlined represented a complete reversal from their original position, equal division of all marital assets, including those Nathan had attempted to hide, restoration of funds removed from joint accounts, primary residence transferred, to me with Nathan assuming responsibility for the unauthorized second mortgage, and significant spousal support reflecting the marriage's duration and my career accommodations for his advancement. These terms appear much more aligned with Colorado law regarding equitable distribution, Judge Hoffman observed, looking to us for response. We find this framework promising, Valerie acknowledged, though we would need to address several specific details before finalizing, particularly regarding the characterization of certain assets and the timeline for implementation. What followed was 3 hours of detailed negotiation, not about whether Nathan would provide fair settlement, but precisely how and when assets would be transferred, documented, and verified. Throughout this process, Nathan remained uncharacteristically subdued, participating technically, but without the commanding presence that had defined him in both professional and personal settings. By late afternoon, we had reached agreement on comprehensive settlement terms that not only restored financial equity but included specific provisions addressing the unauthorized accounts Nathan had established during our marriage. The document contained no explicit reference to his apparent plans for Singapore relocation or potential financial improprieties at Montgomery Adams, but included accelerated implementation timelines that effectively prevented such an exit strategy. As Judge Hoffman concluded the conference, commending both parties for reaching resolution without requiring court intervention, Nathan finally addressed me directly. "You've certainly surprised me today," he said quietly, his tone unreadable. "I wouldn't have thought you capable of this level of thoroughness." "That was always your fundamental mistake, Nathan," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "You never really saw me clearly, just the version of me that served your purposes." Something flickered across his expression, not quite recognition, but perhaps the first glimmer of understanding that the woman he had married, gradually diminished and ultimately attempted to discard, had never been as pliable or limited as he had believed. Outside the mediation center, as Valerie and I debriefed on the settlement details, my phone buzzed with a text from Cassidy. "Just received notification Nathan has been called to an emergency meeting with firm leadership. Movement in our situation?" I showed the message to Valerie, who nodded with measured satisfaction. It appears Nathan's professional house of cards may be collapsing simultaneously with his personal one. the documentation we presented likely prompted Mills to advise him to address potential compliance issues at his firm before they reach regulatory authorities. Should we be concerned about potential repercussions? I asked, suddenly aware that exposing Nathan's financial activities might have set in motion consequences beyond our divorce proceedings. You've done nothing improper, Valerie assured me. The information was legally obtained, and we made no explicit threats or demands based on it. Nathan's professional reckoning is the natural consequence of his own actions, not our strategy. In the days that followed, the settlement agreement was formalized with remarkable efficiency. Nathan's previous delaying tactics replaced by urgent cooperation to finalize terms. Through professional contacts, I learned that he had been placed on administrative leave at Montgomery Adams pending internal investigation, effectively terminating whatever exit strategy he had been developing. 2 weeks after the settlement conference, as I was meeting with Rebecca to establish investment parameters for my newly secured assets, Cassidy contacted me through our secure channel. Nathan resigned from the firm yesterday ahead of compliance. Committee findings? He's been interviewing with smaller firms without strong international connections. Singapore appears to be off the table. I've accepted the position in Chicago, effective immediately. Thank you for everything. The message confirmed what we had suspected. Nathan's carefully constructed escape plan had collapsed entirely, leaving him to face the professional and personal consequences of his actions within U.S. jurisdiction. While he had avoided criminal charges through resignation and cooperation with internal investigation, his career trajectory had been fundamentally altered. I sent Cassidy a brief reply wishing her success in Chicago, then returned to my discussion with Rebecca about long-term financial strategy for Johnson Financial Consulting. With the divorce settled and Nathan's attempts to leave me destitute thoroughly thwarted, I was finally free to focus entirely on building my future rather than protecting myself from his manipulations. 6 months after the settlement conference, I stood in the newly renovated offices of Johnson Financial Consulting, preparing to welcome our first major corporate client. The boutique firm I had established using the foundation my father had presciently created had grown from a part-time consultancy into a thriving practice specializing in financial strategies for women-owned businesses and professionals navigating major life transitions. Rebecca had become both mentor and business ally, referring clients and providing invaluable guidance as I rebuilt my professional identity. Valerie remained not just my attorney but a trusted advisor who had helped translate my divorce experience into specialized expertise for women facing similar situations. The wall behind my desk displayed my restored credentials, MBA certificate from Northwestern, financial advisor certifications, and most prominently, a framed photograph of my father and me at his construction company's 20th anniversary celebration. He had seen in Nathan what I couldn't recognize until it was almost too late, and had quietly established protections that ultimately saved me from financial devastation. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert, a reminder of my monthly lunch with Diane, who had stood beside me throughout the divorce and subsequent rebuilding of my life. These regular connections with supportive friends had become central to my post-Nathan existence, replacing the carefully curated social circle that had dissolved once I was no longer useful to his professional networking. As I gathered my things to leave, I glanced at the business card holder on my desk, Johnson Financial Consulting, with Megan Johnson, founder and principal advisor, embossed in simple, elegant lettering. The deliberate reclamation of my maiden name represented more than professional branding. It symbolized the restoration of an identity that had been gradually submerged during 15 years of marriage. Walking through downtown Denver toward the restaurant where Diane waited, I reflected on the strange, painful journey that had led to this moment of genuine contentment. When Nathan had left that callous note on my nightstand, believing he had stripped me of everything that mattered, I could never have imagined the strength and clarity that would emerge from that devastation. The woman who had stood frozen in shock upon discovering her husband's betrayal, who had momentarily believed herself financially ruined and emotionally broken, had transformed through painful recognition, strategic response, and ultimately, complete reclamation of her own narrative. Nathan had emptied our accounts while I buried my father, believing he had left me with nothing. What he couldn't possibly have understood was that my father had given me something far more valuable than money: the foresight to establish protection against exactly this scenario, and the wisdom to recognize when that protection would be needed. As I approached the restaurant, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a storefront window. Confident posture, purposeful stride, eyes clear and focused. Not the diminished woman who had gradually accommodated Nathan's controlling behavior over 15 years, but the woman my father had always seen beneath that accommodation. I thought of something Dad had told me during one of our final conversations, as his illness progressed. The truest measure of resilience isn't avoiding hardship. It's what you build from the rubble when everything falls apart. Nathan had attempted to leave me with nothing but rubble. Instead, he had inadvertently created the conditions for me to build something stronger, more authentic, and ultimately more valuable than anything we had shared during our marriage. That was the unexpected gift hidden within his betrayal. The opportunity to rediscover my own strength, reclaim my professional identity, and rebuild a life that reflected my values, rather than accommodating someone else's ambitions. As I joined Diane at our table, greeting her with a genuine smile that reached my eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that my father would have been proud of what I had built from the rubble Nathan left behind. Not just financial security, but the reclamation of my authentic self. And that ultimately was the richest asset of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe. And hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.